Welcome everybody. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And today we are lucky to have someone from our rival university across the river, QUT. Sarah Vollert is finishing her PhD there in the math department. She's working on statistical models for improving environmental modeling, something that's very big in our center here. And the focus of her PhD is on conservation decision-making tools, particularly under high uncertainty. So please welcome Sarah.
I definitely think we're more of a friend university than an enemy one, but I'll take it. So I'm kind of going to be talking about maths and stats stuff without really going into much of the maths and stats, so apologies if that's what you came for. But today I'm talking about modelling conservation decisions, and particularly when you have limited data, what can you do and can we borrow from theoretical approach for you? Cool. So predicting future populations in an ecosystem is hard. I'm sure that kind of rings true for a lot of people in the room, trying to work out how things happen in the future when our environment is uncertain, when we have lots of interacting things going on and these systems are really complex. Predicting things with certainty into the future is hard. But predicting the effects of something that's completely unknown is going to be harder. So this is kind of the motivation that I'm sure you might have heard before, things where we have really good intentions of eradicating species from a place where they shouldn't be that end up backfiring. And the classic example that I like to use is the Macquarie Island ecosystem network. So where we have a bunch of different interacting species, we think that it'll help our system if we remove some invasive ones, and then it catastrophically backfires and ends up being worse for us. So looking at all of the different ways that those species can interact, it kind of becomes clear how you can't easily predict what the flow-on effects will be through this network. So if one of those effects is much stronger than the other, it could take a completely different path through how our populations are affected by management. But quantitative modelling might be able to help us with this. So looking at that network there, I would have no idea how getting rid of cats would affect things, whether it would go up or down in certain directions. But quantitative modelling can help us do all of the different options that are available to us. So if we throw a bunch of different numbers in there, we can get a bunch of different outcomes that could potentially happen. And the idea is that quantitatively modelling these, we have a better idea of how that effect might propagate through. Cool. So when I'm talking about ecosystem modelling, I'm talking about taking some sort of ecological understanding of the way that our different species interact, and that might be something like a food web, turning that into predictions of populations through time, and then using that in some form of analysis to predict what the effects of management in that system are. So this is kind of the workflow that I think of as ecological modelling. It might look completely different to someone else, but I'm specifically focusing on this part of this framework. I want to work out how we can build better quantitative models for looking at the way the populations change through time. Cool. And one of the classic examples that maybe isn't the best is the Lotka-Volterra framework. So this is my only math equation, welcome. So where we're looking at the way that populations change through time as a result of the way those populations intrinsically grow, and also interactions between species, how that will affect our populations through time. Cool. So we can gain some idea about the way those species interact through things like our food web, but there are a bunch of parameters that kind of underlie these models that can be really uncertain, but really, really important for our predictions. And so things like, what is the intrinsic growth rate of a species? How do you quantify that, and can you do it with much certainty at all? As well as the interaction strength characterizing the interaction between species. We might have some idea that foxes negatively impact our cat population, but we have a really hard time quantifying how strongly that interaction is especially when there's lots of things that happen in our system that aren't encapsulated in that relationship that could be affecting what that value is. So long story short, those values can be really, really hard to obtain with any certainty. And what that leads to is when we put our prior knowledge of those parameters into our model structure, we can get a bunch of very different looking predictions about what our populations will do through time. And so this is the part where I step in. I'm trying to use different sources of information to hone those predictions into something that looks much more reasonable for what we understand in our system. Cool. So if we don't have much prior information, we get those crazy looking spaghetti plots. And often the idea is that we can use data from any sort of monitoring program to inform those. But what happens when we don't have any information at all, or our information we really think is highly uncertain or limited? Cool. So without data, what do we know about ecosystems in general? And you might answer that we have some ideas from theoretical ecology. There's some theories out there that tell us the way that these populations change through time for any ecosystem. But is that useful? So can we use ecological theory? The theory that I'm particularly focusing on here is the idea of the balance of nature. And so this idea says that ecosystems are a balance of interacting species where populations can fluctuate a lot through time, but they exist in a state of stable coexistence. So we know if the population goes up, another one might compensate and it kind of balances out until we have this group of species that can coexist happily together. Yay. So the two ideas there are coexistence, and if I break them down slightly more mathematically, we have coexistence being the fact that long-term populations are positive. So over a long time period, I know that these species will exist together in a way that they're not going extinct. And they're also somewhat stable. So if I have some small changes to my abundance, I believe that that will still return to my balance of species. So if I hit a koala with my car, the ecosystem doesn't fall apart, kind of idea. So those are my two theories from the ecological literature that I'm going to borrow here. And when we use those, we can generate models just from that information alone. So if we pick some random parameter values from what we believe are possible for those interaction strengths and the growth rates, and then we test if it has a state of stable coexistence, we can use that to build an ensemble of lots of different predictions and look at the way that those populations change through time. So great, we have some form of model without having any data. And if you want to do something like this, there has been a very recently published R package where you can play around with that idea and generate a ensemble of models just from it. So this means that we can very, very quickly construct a set of models that looks at our ecosystem, which is really, really nice because now we don't need to go out and collect data. We can look at this first to potentially look at the ways that our system will unfold with management. And this is used in practice. So this paper has come out this year looking at rewilding in the UK based on these principles. There was some malleefowl conservation that was done looking at those ideas of coexistence and stability. Invasive species eradication, we had species reintroductions to Hog Island, and habitat recovery, species introduction, and invasive species risk. There's been a bunch of different conservation planning studies that have used these ideas of coexistence and stability within their mechanics of building the models. But is that a good idea? So there are some potential issues that are kind of being talked about a bit in literature, but haven't really managed to make their way into those types of conservation planning models where they're using the coexistence and stability ideas. So firstly, a lot of our ecosystems are currently affected by really strong external pressures. And I don't want to say climate change, but climate change. So does that mean that we should be modeling them at their really balanced, nice nature state? Or should we be modeling them as a really highly disturbed system, which is what we're actually seeing in real life? We have this question of whether a human timescale and an ecological timescale are very different things. So I might look at an ecosystem and say that these species will be coexisting happily for ages. But what could really be happening is a very, very long-term decline that's actually on an ecological scale. And there's a bunch of literature that looks at whether a transient dynamics way of looking at that is more appropriate. So we never really know if we're going to get to an equilibrium state. We could just be heading towards it forever as well. If we require our systems to be coexisting and stable, we are saying that extinctions cannot occur. And that seems like a terrible idea for someone who's doing conservation planning, because we're often working with species that are already quite threatened, right? So this is already a huge red flag. Why should we just assume that these species are going to be able to coexist? And if we only use stable coexistence to parameterize our models, that means that nonsense is allowed. And I've got a picture there of a bunch of elephants and one little mouse. And we kind of know, just based on understanding how those populations work, that you don't normally have a lot of huge animals and very few small ones. So there's a bunch of nonsense and logical conclusions about populations that just are excluded from our modeling in general. And lastly, this idea of a balance of nature and coexistence and stability is really hard to empirically verify. You can't just do a test that says, oh yes, this system is happily existing at an equilibrium state. And so because we can't observe it or empirically verify it, then will we ever really know if coexistence and stability is appropriate for our ecosystems? So that's more philosophical. Anyway, that's my rant that I've been waiting to do for my whole PhD. And together, I hope I presented a compelling argument that maybe we shouldn't be considering coexistence and stability when we're modeling conservation actions. Cool. So back to our little information-based diagram here. If we can't use theoretical ecology, or we don't really trust it, then what else can we do? What if we use the knowledge that people have just from observing these systems in the field? Intrinsically, you might understand more about that system without ever actually quantifying what you're seeing there. And so my question now is, can we use any sort of expert information or field knowledge instead of actual data to parameterize these systems? Cool. So on your right there, we have a bunch of predictions that come from looking at a model that has stable coexistence. And you might immediately be saying something like, I don't think those population sizes are realistic. And so when I'm looking at stability and coexistence, I'm looking at the long-term population sizes. And I might say something like, oh, there's never been more than 10 of whatever this species is. And so I could incorporate that into my model. But you can also see that those populations can go outside of that because I'm only looking at the long-term populations. So what happens if we consider only the last 5 years of what we've observed in our ecosystem? Well, we can incorporate that sort of information in there as well. So now I not only care about what those population sizes are in the long term, I think over the last 5 years, populations should probably only be in this range. And lastly, I wanted to know, like, can populations grow this fast? Biologically, a lot of species are limited in how quickly they can grow, and this doesn't encapsulate that information at all. As well as this, we might know that something like a massive decline in populations hasn't really happened in the last 5 years. So could we exclude that? The answer is yes. And so these are a bunch of different assumptions that we could be using instead of assuming that ecological theory. As well as that, for any system, there might be more specific things to the ecosystem that we care about. And some examples here are known responses to management. So if something has happened to your ecosystem in the past, say you eradicated cats, and you saw that the rabbit population went up for some reason, you can incorporate that within your model as a source of knowledge. As well as that, we have observed population trends that aren't quite quantified, but we know they're out there, and logic tests. So something like, if I remove all of the plants from my ecosystem, my herbivores should be dying out. So those kinds of sources of information aren't included in modeling usually, but they could still provide us lots of value. Cool. So wanting some statistics, how can we actually find these values? I promise I've just included videos. So on the left-hand side here, I'm considering the most intuitive option, where you pick some parameter values, you test if they meet your criteria, and then you keep the ones that do. I should have some little green dots appearing that meet my criteria. So if we're randomly choosing and testing if they match the behaviors we're after, then we can find a bunch of models that meet our criteria, but it can be very slow, particularly if you're considering large movement. On the right-hand side is something that's a little bit more fancy. So this is a sequential Monte Carlo type move. And essentially what that means is we're moving a swarm of different parameter values towards something that looks more promising. So I'm heading more towards population sizes that look realistic to me. And that's a much faster approach. So that's all the statistics there. Essentially what this means is that we are progressively removing the behaviors from our models that we think are unrealistic until we end up with a bunch of models that look like something that we're expecting. And we can use that approach for whatever knowledge you want to encode into your model. Cool. So now that we've got these kinds of tools, these new ideas about information that we want to incorporate in our model, we have a way to produce an ensemble of population models without using data, just based on knowledge. So what do we find? I'm going to talk a little bit about a hypothetical example where I'm considering a semi-arid Australian ecosystem here. And I'm going to remove some of the dingoes from this just to test what would happen to, I think in this case, I'm going to look at what happens to small vertebrates. So the idea here is that I define my ecosystem model based on this food network. And I look at what information I have about any of these species. Say I know there's only a limited number of dingoes that can exist. And then I find the parameters using those nice videos I showed before and simulate what that conservation action of removing the dingoes might be and analyze the effects of that on each of my models. Cool. So if I'm removing some dingoes and looking at the change to the small vertebrate population, I can see there that comparing two different sources of information can really change the way that our predictions look. And so particularly the fact that we've got this weird drop that happens through our theoretical ecology knowledge in comparison to a much more flat version that uses field knowledge. And we can kind of end up with very different qualitative trends that come out of those predictions, which unfortunately I haven't included a picture of. Cool. What about something that's a little bit more relevant? What if I'm looking at how sure each of those sets of models are in predicting what the effect will be on small mammals? And so if my value is quite low, that means I'm pretty certain what's going to happen to those species. A lot of my models agree. Whereas if I'm up the top, I'm less certain of what the response is. So maybe 50% of my models say that it'll benefit the mouse and 50% say that it will hurt the mouse. And so I find that I can get very different looking decision criteria from changing the different knowledge that goes into those models. And so I guess what my point is here is that it's really important to consider which information is going into those, particularly if you don't trust coexistence and stability. And so what do those predictions actually look like if I'm looking at which information is used to construct my models? Using stability and coexistence assumptions, I found that 99.99% of those models produced predictions that didn't match with what I said my expert knowledge was. So maybe they produced populations that were too high, too low, or they just had crazy dynamics that I didn't think were okay. So our stability and coexistence assumptions can produce things that look quite unreasonable, but as well as that, our stability and coexistence assumptions can exclude reasonable looking predictions. So all of these models might look reasonable to someone who has those ideas on what population sizes should be, and yet they would be excluded because they don't show a long-term stable coexisting state. So that's kind of the idea of a long-term ecosystem timeline versus a short-term timeline. Okay, and what about when we have some data? So very recently, there has been a paper published in Ecology Letters that's quite pessimistic about the role that these sorts of models can play in conservation planning. And essentially, they showed that even when you have quite a good data set, you can still have very uncertain predictions and very bad predictions that fail. So even when we have good data, we can end up with uncertain models. And so the idea here is that what if we combined our data with also some ecosystem knowledge? And we've developed the methods now to do that. So here I haven't really explained what I'm doing, but I've got data and also coexistence and stability assumptions into this model. And I found that you can get quite different looking responses to management when you include coexistence and stability as well as just data. Cool. So let's summarize that. So quantitative modeling can be quick and cheap and allow us to look at the potential effects of conservation management, I guess with a grain of salt. Coexistence and stability, hopefully I've convinced you to think twice about incorporating them because they might be inappropriate depending on the context that you're considering. These results are quite theoretical. So in every case, my expert knowledge was a number that I picked that seemed nice. So again, a grain of salt that goes with the outcomes there. But they do show that it is important to consider the knowledge that you put into your models because they can drastically change what your conservation outcome would be with one of these tools. But we have the methods now that we can consider a different way, and we can also consider doing data with expert knowledge as well, if you feel confident enough to include it. And I guess more of a pessimistic point for me here, conservation modeling like this is really highly uncertain. There's always going to be really big uncertainty around whether the model you're using is appropriate for the scenario, the information that you're putting in, whether that is reflective of what you're doing. And then at the end of the day, we're modeling really, really complex systems with a low stochasticity in them. And so there's going to be a lot of uncertainty that always remains in them. But I think that quantitative modeling can be useful for showing this. It can be useful for showing that there are crazy numbers of different outcomes that could happen when you interfere with an ecosystem. And I'd like to kind of bring it back to that original slide I had where this is happening in real life, right? We are interacting with these ecosystems and we need to be prepared for the fact that there are potential outcomes that we can't foresee. Well, that's all from me.
Okay, we have time for some questions. And do you want to be in charge of that? And then we'll just let you know if there's some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Because you can see.
Thank you, that was a great talk. Really interesting stuff to think about. I had a question in terms of obviously like Macquarie Island, for example, people can have a good idea of what they think or hope will happen.
Yeah.
And obviously that does not happen. So how do you, I guess, control for the fact that even expert expectations can and often are wrong?
Yeah. And I guess a big thing when you're using expert knowledge as data in a model is that you need to be kind of certain around what that knowledge is. And there's always going to be bias in what people think, right? If you're really, really invested in your species of interest, you tend to think that your conservation action might have more of a chance of succeeding. At the moment, the methods for doing this are still kind of under development by me because I've been writing my thesis, but it's definitely a place that we want to go in being able to incorporate certainty around those expert opinions. Still very much an unknown.
Sarah, really great presentation. I had a couple of questions about uncertainty and expert opinion with model structure itself, whether you actually include an interaction or not, what components you actually include in the model, like what's the boundary of the model. I'm wondering with the ensemble modelling approach, how that can inform or like falsify the model structure that experts think maybe this is how the food web works, but can quantitative modelling inform the structure itself?
That's really interesting. I did toy around with the idea of including like nodes and connections in your network with uncertainty. So 50% of the time I would include it, 50% of the time I wouldn't. And then I would look at, when I matched it to my expert knowledge, how many of those models from each side of the network would be looking like they match my knowledge. Does that make sense? I feel like I said that really badly. But I kind of found that in this case, because all of the information I'm putting in is still so uncertain, I couldn't really get any information about the structure back out. And in particular, this paper here, we found that even with a really good data set, we couldn't infer competition, mutualism, or predator-prey relationships out of it. Most of the time they came back as 50-50 on every model. So that structural uncertainty in the network is obviously going to be huge, and it plays a huge role in the predictions you get. As well as that, like the local Altera versus other things, again, is going to be huge. And I think at this point, I'm so overwhelmed with how much uncertainty you can get from so many different places that I've kind of just had to stick to the parameter values itself.
I'm just pulling on his question, the interactions you have, obviously you can, another model you can look at, and that's what with mentioning examples is, obviously you can have your predator-prey interactions and prey switching, which makes it even more complex. And I've tried to set up models very simplistic and looking at that, and obviously what you get is you get all these strange dynamics where things go extinct anyway, so then you have to create refuge and assumptions about other species eating and natural mortality, and then you don't know where to get those numbers from. But
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you had considered those something different than just a interaction tool, and when you actually looked at models which had the predator prey in it.
I haven't looked beyond lots of Altera because my work has really been to find how to incorporate the information in it.
Yeah.
But I have seen some papers that use agent-based modeling and have found that it's much easier to match data sets when you're comparing it to something like this, where it's very restrictive parameters.
And the other thing is, if you do look at empirical data, you probably need a very close system.
Yes.
Otherwise, you don't need that problem. So you need boundaries.
Yeah, for sure.
Hi, thank you. One of the ways that the sort of nature thing was resolved was spatial structure.
Yeah.
So like can't expect everything to be even all over space.
Yeah.
And so net populations. For example, like something's going extinct over there, but they'll have one over here. So just that gives overall broader balance to the system. Have you thought about including spatial structure in this?
Again, I feel like I was trying to restrict myself to a model structure that was simple just so I could get the methods working, because that is predominantly where I was focused. But I think more importantly on that point is that a lot of the models that are using the balance of nature in constructing their ensembles aren't spatial. And so this paper was kind of like a big call out to say, like, please consider what those implications could be of using coexistence and stability, especially when you're not looking at the spatial domain. Does that make sense?
Great talk, and congratulations on all the papers. There were at least 2 or 3 with your name on it.
Thank you.
Multiple of them had this phrase sort of consequences for conservation management decisions. I'm curious what the consequences are. Because basically what you're saying is we can't tell you what's going to happen, right? Like it's like guessing is good.
Yeah.
All we got. So what's the consequence? What do we do instead?
This paper was heavily motivated by things like that Macquarie Island, like where you try and eradicate something to help and it just ends up being worse. I think, yeah, the consequences for me have been, I feel like I've been saying this a million times, but I've been really focused on the technical part of it. And yeah, I think just modeling in general is always just going to be so uncertain that I think a lot of the benefits that we get from it are just showing how uncertain these systems are, and that it can be incredibly consequential to do an action without considering those things.
Is there any suggestion that, you know, like the classic kind of adaptive management approaches where you just sort of hit the system a couple times in different ways to see what's going to happen?
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, you need to have funding that continues for adaptive management.
No one really pays for that, but we like to imagine what would happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess when you're doing adaptive management, you'd still have something like this that's kind of trying to fact check on, did it actually go that way? Was that statistically relevant as a change, or was that just a change in population fluctuations that happened? Yeah, I still think quantitative modeling needs to kind of underpin even the monitoring of what has happened. Yeah.
The Macquarie Island example is used a lot, but based on what you presented, I would have expected them to be wrong if they based their modeling approach on these principles.
Yeah.
did they end up, how did they? That was 10 or 15 years ago, right?
Hmm.
So like what? How good were their models
Yeah,
after 15 years, like how's it look right today?
I would love to know, but I don't. There has been some recent work that's been looking at like replicating management that's happened kind of in that vein of like using modeling to see, given that we've observed this change, what do we think the system looks like and can we adapt our strategy based on that? But I haven't seen too many studies that look at that, and I think particularly because I don't get much data from where I'm sitting as a method.
Just to, can I cause I think like the problem was that, like, you take out the cats, and I this is kind of, I was curious to ask, like,
Yeah.
my understanding is they kind of thought the rabbits would be fine because there was myxoma virus.
Mm.
So it wasn't that they didn't appreciate that the cats would potentially release the rabbits, but it's just that they anticipated that there was another functional control that would keep rabbit numbers low that didn't actually keep rabbit numbers low. But they have subsequently gone and eradicated all the introduced mammals. So I think there's some nice studies now that have looked at like the next level of impact, like seabird responses to the full eradication that have come out in the last kind of 2 or 3 years. So there's kind of an update after this that is slightly more hopeful.
But the original one didn't work, and so they had to go and kill the rabbits.
Yeah.
But so that supports your theory that these things are really messy.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That's good.
Would you be able to change, like, can you see if you change the parameters, like, could you go back in time and try
I
and remake the
really want to
decision?
do it. Yeah, I've been trying to do that for ages, but I feel like other things got in the way. Yeah, because they have, I think, successfully now got all the vegetation to come back, because that really was the problem, right? The rabbits just destroyed it. I don't even see the virus on here. Oh, yeah. I guess, yeah, the main point there is just like, because you don't know how strong the effect of this relative to this is, then like we don't know what's gonna happen.
Yeah, so very interesting talk. I'm interested in the flip side. So let's say I'm a manager and I come to you and you say, like, forget about ecosystem modeling based on those things because it just not gonna work, and there's no sincerity, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, so what do I do? Is there, I know you crossed out monitoring programs, there's no data, so is the answer some data or to actually make those models more realistic, or what's the answer if I'm a manager?
I wish I knew. I think at the end of the day, it just needs to be part of the body of evidence, but not entirely trusted as it like equals with just expert knowledge in general. So I think,
So we need some
data
data before we move forward, or?
yeah, I think some data will always be helpful in understanding these systems better, but I think mathematically there also needs to be a lot of development around, do we build a bespoke model for the system that we're studying rather than just throwing it into an existing framework, and whether that would help. Yeah, I think the answer to pretty much every question is I don't know.
One is more for your appreciation, on the base of so many uncertainties on mistakes, uncertainties, let's say. I guess that's how science works, trying. What's the role then of modeling in our decision making right now? Because as you said, like, if a manager takes it and say like, can't trust me.
Yeah,
So why do we use it?
I think it can prompt you to ask more questions as a experimentalist. So I think your study could show you certain scenarios that might happen that maybe you wouldn't have considered as a conservationist. So if my model was showing that, oh wait, there is a chance that this virus doesn't actually take on the rabbits as well as we thought it would, we might be able to go and use that information to learn more targetedly about what would happen.
So even though we say that it's for predictions, for modeling,
Mm.
you can't use it for that, but we can use it for learning more.
I think if you're doing it for predictions, it really needs to come with this grain of salt. Yeah. But I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no more administrative questions. It looked like, from a naive perspective, most of what you were trying to do was to constrain the populations to look more like they currently look.
Yeah.
But like current conditions are not necessarily a good predictor of future conditions, so is it? Were you ever concerned that you were being too conservative in terms of what the system could do?
That's a really great question. I think that because in my mind it was always just in comparison to coexistence and stability or any data that you can get. My idea was like, what would I actually know? If I knew people that had existed in a place for the last 100 years, maybe they would have some knowledge about that, and that's all that I had to go off. That's not what we're currently using. Yeah, but I do definitely think that I feel like a financial advisor, but past performance is not a good predictor of future performance. Yeah.
Are there any Zoom questions?
No, they're all quiet.
Okay, cool. I have a question about the recent ecology letters paper that you had at the end.
Yeah.
Can you? So to me, it looked like you did a really good, the data and the models looked really good. And you were like, they're horrible. And I was like, that's way better than I've ever gotten. So,
I can definitely.
I don't know if it's a different bait, like. Ecologists might just have a really low bar compared to mathematicians.
Far did I go?
It's the very end.
There we go. So this data was from a microscope. So in this, I'm picturing a petri dish of 4 different bacteria that are interacting with each other, and they have a microscope counting how many of each species there are across, I think it was 18 days. To me, that seems like for a very controlled, we know exactly what's going on in here. We have full observability of that system. We even have some idea about how these bacteria should be interacting. And yet for this species here, I basically don't know what's going to happen one day in the future. So this, all of these predictions were trained on the first 18 data points and then used to predict one step into the future. And we kind of found that this was a good looking one. And yet for that last species and also to some degree the top one, we do get uncertainty under all those conditions. Yeah, I mean, that might look good. But I'm expecting that given that we're literally looking at a petri dish and we know how these species should be interacting, we should have more idea than that.
Yeah, like. If this was a different type of stat,
Yeah.
so our squared would be like really high. Not like so high that we would never get that in ecology.
Yeah.
But I agree, if it's a petri dish, you should have better.
Yeah, there was also a lot more results in that paper, which I guess I wish I'd put in there more. So looking at the interactions between species, there in the ensemble there was 50-50 on most of them about whether the interaction would be positive or negative at all. Whereas we knew that they were all competing species. So we couldn't infer how the species were interacting from that data. And most importantly, predicting management changes, we would get 50-50s on pretty much everything. So if I was like, oh, let's immediately kill this species, then predicting what would happen to the rest of them, my models had no idea at all. So I guess, again, it's more about having the grain of salt and questioning whether these models actually are as good as they've been promoted to be previously, because I haven't seen too many studies that look at this seriously.
Have you looked into alternatives to Volterra?
Are you reviewer 3? Yeah, we did look at a few alternatives, but there's so many nowadays that it was really hard to say that we can't look at all of them. Our conclusion was kind of like, as soon as you're using something that's really general like this, that it won't work. for every ecosystem. And that this is kind of like a warning that we should be considering it for all of our models, not just Volterra.
Yeah, so as you were talking about knowledge, one thing that struck me is that this is a prime example of where indigenous knowledge could be put in.
Yeah.
And that knowledge is not 5 years, it's
Yeah,
thousands of
that's
years
true.
old. And it'll be interesting to see what happens when that type of knowledge
Yeah.
is used to sort of calibrate your models
Yeah.
and basically.
No, that's a really good point.
And some of it from Australia, and go back to when, you know, there was climate change back then.
Yeah.
In a different direction, so it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Seem to be prime for that kind of collaboration, because you're using knowledge as
Yeah.
opposed to data.
I mean, even just, I find the idea of data really constraining. Like you have a budget to consider, you have limited time, limited resources. Like the fact that you kind of know these things if you've just been out in the field is super valuable and not at all considered in most of these quantitative studies.
It's obviously been a thought-provoking talk. You framed a lot of that in terms of management decisions, you're going to start with projections.
Yeah.
We looked at the next steps to decisions here. The decision might change with it, like say your projection might be a bit off, but you might still take the same decision.
Yeah.
Some degree of confidence in that. Or looked at satisfy signals.
Yeah, I think that definitely needs to be the next step that's kind of plugged in. All of my decisions that I've been looking at have been pretty rudimentary. Looking at just like, do we even know if this change will result in this population going up or down? And very, very basic statistics, I guess, that I've been looking at have been quite uncertain. And I have done a little bit of work with Matt on value of information stuff, which could kind of very easily plug into this framework and working out like whether this information actually is giving us any value in terms of the decision that we're going to.